And after that presentation, we know that carbohydrates are the macronutrient that are going to impact our blood sugars. Um, so when we are talking about carbohydrates, if you ever read food labels, what we're really focusing on is that total carbohydrate number. But then again, not all foods that contain carbohydrates have a food label to refer to. So I'm going to go into the different types of foods that do contain carbohydrates. Um, so added sugars, obviously, if we're having just sugar, white sugar in any like desserts or candies, other sweeteners such as honey, maple syrup, sugar sweetened beverages such as soda, sweetened coffees or teas. These are all considered added sugars. They're considered a carbohydrate. Next up, we have grains, which I think this category is kind of the poster child of carbohydrates. When we're talking about grains, we're talking about wheat. So any food products made with wheat, rice, flour, bread, crackers, pastas. So really any grain. I think primarily most people living in the United States eat wheat for most of their grains, or rice, but obviously there's lots of other grains that I didn't list here, that can't, buckwheat, quinoa, any of these other grains that I didn't list here, are also a carbohydrate source. Fruits. Fruit is considered a carbohydrate. So when I'm saying fruit, I mean whole fruits, dried fruits, fruit juice, blended fruit, like in smoothies. Um, and then vegetables also contain carbohydrates. And there is a difference between those starchy vegetables that contain that starchy component, which we consider to be more of a carbohydrate source, like potatoes, corn, peas, winter squash, like butternut squash or acorn squash. And then non-starchy vegetables, they do contain carbohydrates, but they don't have as much of that starchy component, such as broccoli. We'll get into that more, don't worry. And then legumes such as beans, chickpeas, lentils, these all contain a carbohydrate. And lastly, dairy. So things like milk, yogurt, cottage cheese, cream cheese. And I also want to add that I didn't include on this slide is non-dairy substitutes, because those are gaining popularity. We have a lot more options of those at the store today. So any non-dairy substitutes made with oats or soy or peas, hemp, all of those do also contain carbohydrates as well. So again, we're talking about total carbohydrates of a food, and we'll get into the nitty gritty about how different carbohydrates that I listed on here can impact our blood sugars differently. I wanted to briefly discuss the glycemic index, and I wanted to bring it up because many of the clients that I work with who have diabetes, maybe many of you have heard of the term glycemic index, and have questions about it and are wondering if they should base their food choices based off of the glycemic index of food. So I'm going to touch on it briefly, but we're not going to spend a ton of time on glycemic index today. So the glycemic index was created about 40 years ago. It's a scale from 1 to 100, and the purpose was to help those with diabetes, more specifically type 1 diabetes, manage their blood sugars by, giving all these foods that contain carbohydrates a number on the scale 1 to 100, whereas 100 impacts our blood sugars greatly, 1 impacts our blood sugars minimally, and use the scale to help us make our food decisions. We now know that this is not an optimal marker for carbohydrate quality, so actually is not used in diabetes education very much anymore. And that is because it wasn't the most realistic for a lot of people, in that, they're everybody has different bodies, and everybody's different bodies can react to different foods and how they impact your body's blood sugars a bit differently. So we found that this scale wasn't really that optimal and precise for everyone. Additionally, different foods could rate differently on the scale, and There were lots of different contributing factors to that. They can measure the same food multiple times, they get a different number on the glycemic index scale, as well as just the variety of food products out there. For example, there's lots of different types of white rice, and so that can all have different numbers. And ultimately, it kind of just made this whole carbohydrate counting for blood sugar management a bit more confusing for most people. So we really don't use it anymore. Um, Blood glucose or blood sugar management really is dependent on more than simply just our carbohydrate consumption, and other things impact our blood sugar response, including but not limited to our genetics, our lifestyle. Some of these, we don't have as much control over, but then other things we do have a bit more control over, such as our meal timing, our meal preparedness, and then the non carbohydrate components of foods or that meal. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. All right. So rather than focusing on a number on the scale, I like to think of how foods impact our blood sugars like a rocket. And simply put, I used the arrow to indicate the rocket on these next slides with how different foods can impact our blood sugars a bit differently. Um, So the total carbohydrates of a food, no matter what that food is going to indicate how far that rocket travels. Um, but the type of carbohydrates that we're gonna talk about the different types today, they really indicate how fast that rocket is climbing. So on this first slide, these are a list of simple carbohydrates, and when we consume these simple carbohydrates, especially when we are consuming them without any other meal component, any other food item with that snack or that meal, they are going to increase our blood sugars fairly rapidly. So, some examples of simple carbohydrates are things like juice, soda, and I saw some questions about diet sodas. What I'm talking about here is regular soda that does contain a sweetener like sugar. Um, Pastas, specifically pastas that are not made with whole wheat or whole grains, white rice, white bread, any of these other more refined grain products, crackers that are not made with whole wheat flour, sweetened tea or coffee. I listed pasta twice, sorry about that. Other sweeteners, glucose tabs, candy, dessert, pastries. These are just some examples of what we consider simple carbohydrates. And what that means is they are a carbohydrate and they don't really contain much else, much other nutrients with these food items besides that carbohydrate. So we're going to digest them very quickly. They're going to impact our blood sugars and cause a blood sugar rise more rapidly than other types of carbohydrates. All right, so next we're talking about more moderate blood sugar impact. So it's still going to rise. It's going to rise, not as fast as the foods listed on the previous slide, but we are going to still see an increase. And these are foods that are considered processed carbohydrates with a little amount of fiber. So in that processing, sometimes fiber can be taken away, sometimes sugar can be added, whatever the case may be. I have a short list of examples for this one. These include instant oatmeal, low fiber granola bars, low fiber cereals, and instant mashed potatoes. So these are just some examples of foods that are going to impact our blood sugars. And if we get into the meal pairing or building balanced meal section in a bit, you'll see we can have these foods, but we'll just be wanting to pair them with other things since on their own, they don't have a lot to really slow down that blood sugar rise. Now, this next category, this is going to have a lower blood sugar impact even. And these are carbohydrates that either contain a high fiber amount or a protein component. And our bodies are going to digest, that fiber or that protein component along with the carbohydrates. And we aren't going to have such an influx of the carbohydrates, the glucose into our bloodstream, which causes that rapid rise in blood sugars. So carbohydrates with high fiber include foods like whole wheat breads, whole wheat or whole grain crackers, whole wheat pastas, brown rice, beans, edamame, or fruit, um, or carbohydrates that contain a protein. So these are going to be things like those dairy or non-dairy substitutes. So things like cottage cheese, yogurt, milk, other cheeses, a smoothie where you might add some protein, maybe in the form of protein powder or yogurt or milk. Any of the non-dairy substitutes can also fit in this category as well if they do contain a sufficient amount of protein. Um, so I don't have a slide for this, but I wanted to touch on it briefly. Um, Carbohydrates, any grain, like we talked about, a grain um, is a carbohydrate. However, there's a difference between more whole grains or whole wheat, or brown rice, like on the slide, rice is a grain, versus those more refined. And what I'm saying in when I'm talking about refined grains is a grain naturally, when it grows, has an outer fibrous layer. And then in food processing, that outer fibrous layer is actually removed to make things like white flour versus whole wheat flour, white rice versus brown rice. And so when we're talking about whole wheat, whole grains, these are the least refined. They still have that fiber component, and they're going to cause less of a rapid rise in our blood sugars. There's some great questions. I'll touch on these really quickly. So what protein powder do I recommend? First of all, if you are getting adequate protein in your diet and you can get that from food, maybe a protein powder isn't necessarily necessary. Um, Sometimes protein powders can be expensive, and so simply having food first forms of protein can be best, especially because sometimes protein powders do contain a lot of added sugar, which again is more of a simple carbohydrate and is going to cause a blood sugar increase. And so, if we're talking about protein powders, choose one that you like and that you like the taste. Be mindful of the carbohydrate amount in it if we're talking about blood sugar management. And not all, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but not all protein powders are considered a complete protein. There are some that are incomplete. And so I would refer back to my previous presentation if you want more information on that. Low fiber cereal. So some cereals that contain more fiber are going to be those that contain whole grains, like some Cheerios or frosted mini wheats. More low fiber cereal would be more of those just sugary cereals like Fruit Loops, Kix, Cocoa Puffs, and they really don't contain. They're mostly made with those refined grains. And then the last question I'll answer on this slide, and then we'll move on. And I will get to everyone else's questions. But what about multigrain bread? That's a really great question. And now I'm realizing I should have included a slide on this in this presentation. But if you look at bread at the store and you're looking at the ingredient list, if you're wanting to choose a whole wheat bread or a whole grain bread that truly is made with over 50% wheat of these whole grains or whole wheat, so they do contain that fibrous component, make sure to look at the ingredient lists, and you want whole wheat or whole grain to be listed as the very first ingredient. That word whole is kind of that magic word that we want to be looking for as the very first ingredient, as ingredients are listed by weight in descending order on that list. So check the ingredient list, look for that whole wheat. Some of them can be listed as like honey wheat or multigrain, and they may be a little darker in color, but that really doesn't indicate that they are actually a whole wheat product. And so just flip the bag of bread over and look at the ingredient list. That's a really great question. All right. So the types of carbohydrates that are going to have the slightest impact on our blood sugars are going to be low carb vegetables. So these are going to be things like carrots, zucchini, broccoli, tomatoes, lettuce, onion, peppers, and celery. I wrote celery, but that was supposed to say celery. Um, Whereas those starchy vegetables, because they do contain more of that starch component, are going to impact our blood sugars a bit more. All right, so now we've talked a bit about how different types of carbohydrates, how they cause that trajectory of our blood sugar rocket to vary, with those more simple carbohydrates really causing a rapid rise in our blood sugar rocket, and those complex carbohydrates, or those carbohydrates that have, more oomph, more nutrition bang for their buck, more components such as proteins, fibers, other things. Those are going to cause a more moderate rise in our blood sugars, even though they are still going to cause a rise because they are still a carbohydrate. Um, Oftentimes, we don't eat carbohydrates on their own. And if we are talking about blood sugar management and blood sugar control and meal planning, it's really important to be including other components to our meals and snacks besides just that carbohydrate. And so these are the four categories that of foods that I recommend including on your plate when we're talking about a nutritionally balanced meal. So first up, we want to make sure we're having lots of produce on our plate. Um, and produce, I will say, can be fresh, it can be frozen, it can be canned. And just having vegetables on our plate, we know most people living, especially living in the United States, are not getting as much produce and as much fiber as recommended. So produce provides that fiber. It also provides our diet with vitamins and minerals. Um, we want to aim to have about half of our plate, if we're talking about a meal, consisting of non-starchy vegetables or fruit. And then the kind of next smallest portions are going to be the protein and the carbohydrates. So, proteins on our plate can help with blood sugar management. They can also contribute to what we call the satiety factor, or how satisfying a meal is. So, we want the protein component to take up about a quarter of our plate. Um, if you want to review on these as well, I really recommend going back again and watching that Nutrition 101 class. The next quarter of our plate, we want to be filled with that carbohydrate component. If you have a carbohydrate with fiber, so like those whole wheat, whole grain products that we talked about, those are just going to even help with our blood sugar management. But carbohydrates provide our bodies with energy. If we're eating them consistently, they can help to manage our blood sugars. And also, carbohydrates, because they do contain the fiber and the vitamins and minerals, they can help with other things such as gastrointestinal health, which we may not focus on so much when we're talking about diabetes specifically, but is a really important part of our overall health picture. So we want for these carbohydrates to take up about a quarter of our plate, and we want to try to aim to have these carbohydrates, this carbohydrate portion, be more complex carbohydrates versus simple carbohydrates more often. Um, and then lastly, healthy fats. These aren't necessarily going to take up a portion of our plate, but they are going to add flavor and fullness, helping us to feel full and satisfied from our meal. But they are going to take up the smallest portion on our plate. And again, they really are to help things cook, like using oils to saute vegetables. They're going to add flavor, such as butter on toast or dressings or marinades, but they're not necessarily going to be a portion of our plate. All right, so I wanted to kind of continue on this conversation of how carbohydrates impact our blood sugars, and then we will get in and talking about nutritional balance and how to add other components to our meals besides those carbohydrates. And then we'll get into some examples of meals and snacks. So this is my favorite example to give. I give it often, so some of you may have heard it before. But if we take a whole apple, an apple is a fruit, therefore it contains carbohydrates. So if we take a whole apple and we put that apple in a juicer and we toss out all the pulp and the seeds and the stem and the skin, and we're just left with that glass of apple juice, and we drink that apple juice, first of all, we're going to be consuming that apple juice, most of us fairly quickly in comparison to the apple. But then it really is missing that fiber that is going to help to slow down our digestion of the carbohydrate as much. So if we're drinking juice, our bodies are good, and we're not having that juice with anything else. We're not having it with a snack, with a meal. If we're having it kind of on our own, just to simplify this example, our bodies are going to digest that juice very quickly. That is going to be converted to glucose in our bloodstream, and it's going to cause a rapid rise in our blood sugars. If you decided instead of juicing your apple to eat that whole apple, and you're going to be chewing it, biting it, it's going to take a little bit longer to eat. And then once we do digest it, it has all that fibrous component, right, through our digestive tract. And our bodies are going to take a bit longer to digest that apple. Therefore, it is still going to cause a blood sugar increase. But that digestion process to get glucose into our bloodstream is going to be slowed down just a bit, and it's going to cause less of a rapid rise in our blood sugars. Now, if we take it one step further and we're thinking of, okay, how can I continue to add nutrients, add something to this snack to help with blood sugar management? What if you added some peanut butter to these apple slices? And peanut butter contains some protein and it contains some fats. And that's just other nutrients that your body is going to have to digest at the same time as digesting those apple slices. Therefore, it's going to cause an even more moderate increase in our blood sugars. So again, I'll just go back and I'll touch on this later. We'll circle back around it. But if you take anything away from this presentation today, I hope it is that for blood sugar management, something that's really easy to focus on is not what we should take away or reduce or remove from our diet, but more thinking what we can add to our diet to really help um, boost nutrition, increase variety as far as our food, and help with blood sugar management. All right, so I wanted to get into some examples of breakfast, lunch, dinners, and snacks. These were just some really quick and easy examples that I came up with off the top of my head. But if anyone has any others that they would like to contribute, please feel free to add them to the chat box. I know some people have typed some other questions. I promise we'll get to them towards the end. But if we're talking about breakfasts, those things that we may have with breakfast that are going to cause a really rapid increase in our blood sugars are going to be juice, as we just talked about extensively with my last example, sweetened tea or coffee, sweetened breakfast pastries, especially those made with refined grains or white flour. So if we're thinking like cinnamon rolls or Pop Tarts, or pastries from your favorite coffee shop that aren't made with whole wheat or whole grain. Those are going to increase our blood sugars fairly rapidly. Next, things like instant oatmeal, those low fiber cereals or sweetened yogurts, they're still going to increase our blood sugar, but they do have some other nutritional components such as a little fiber, some protein. So they're going to cause a rise, but not quite as rapid. And then the lower impact is going to be foods that have even more fiber components, more complex carbohydrates, have more protein, such as smoothies that include berries, greens, and a protein source. So my favorite protein to add to smoothies is yogurt. Also, if you really are having a hard time, thinking of a protein to add to a food, you can always have it on the side. So you could have like a smoothie with a hard-boiled egg on the side of it. Plain or lightly sweetened yogurt with a high fiber cereal, or whole wheat toast with an egg. And then a breakfast that is considered low carb, that is going to cause just a slight increase in our blood sugars would be something like a breakfast scramble with eggs and low carb vegetables or non starchy vegetables such as spinach, peppers, onions, and tomato. All right. So for lunches, here's some simple examples that I came up with. If we're having things like ramen noodles or plain white rice or couscous, these are going to really cause the most rapid increase in our blood sugars. More moderate would be a food like macaroni and cheese that is still made with that, white flour, but does have some cheese in it, so will have some protein. A low blood sugar response lunch would be like a meat and cheese sandwich that you make with whole wheat bread, um, a soup that might have vegetables and beans, and then more of a slight impact of blood sugar rise with a lunch might look like a salad with grilled meat and a whole wheat roll. For dinners, if you're having soda or sweet tea, if you're having dried fruit, sweet sauces like barbecue, teriyaki, sometimes some like marinara sauces can have some added sugar in them, and these can cause a rapid rise in our blood sugars. Um, More of a moderate rise would be something like spaghetti and meatballs made with white pasta and then having a side salad. Um, More of a low blood sugar rise would be a hamburger, and you're having a whole wheat bun with that hamburger, and then you're having some non-starchy vegetables on the side, such as a side salad and some roasted broccoli. Um, or those that have more of a slight would be like a stir fry, and you're using brown rice or another whole grain, vegetables, and a protein. And then lastly, some snacks. Um, those that are going to cause a very rapid increase in our blood sugars are going to be things like cookies or crackers that aren't made with whole wheat flour, candy, soda, dried fruit, um, low fiber granola bars. So, like a Quaker chewy granola bar, sweetened yogurt, crackers and cheese, and then more of a low blood sugar impact are going to be like hummus and vegetables, cottage cheese and fruit, apple slices with peanut butter, and then more of a slight would be hard boiled eggs and snap peas, celery and peanut butter. So hopefully I didn't bore you too much with all of those examples, but the aim of that was giving you kind of some realistic meal and snack ideas and how we're thinking of adding nutrition to help with that blood sugar management. Um, so as you can see, in this category, um, things like the cookies and the candy, they don't have much other components to them besides just that carbohydrate. Whereas, the foods in the bottom category with the snap peas or celery, those are going to have fiber. They're going to be lower carbohydrate. They're going to have vitamins and minerals, and then they're also going to have a protein component, some fats in them, and so those are going to help with our nutritional balance. So hopefully that helps to kind of wrap your brain around this topic. Um, yes, and you are exactly right. The healthier options tend to be a bit more satisfying and fill us up until, the next meal or snack. All right, so I wanted to wrap up this whole discussion about different carbohydrates and how they impact our blood sugars and different meal components and how they can also impact our blood sugars with a few like pieces of advice. So the point of all of this talk about carbohydrates, simple versus complex carbohydrates, how they cause the trajectory of our blood sugar rocket to change, how other meal components can impact that. Um, it's important to have, increased awareness of this to make informed and educated food decisions regarding our meals and snacks. But again, driving this point home, I hope I really am. It's a lot easier for most of us, and I think it helps with our kind of thought process around these foods, and really staying away from, kind of getting down in the dumps about thinking, well, I've have this diabetes diagnosis, I can't have any of these foods, rather than thinking about what you can't have, you shouldn't have, what you should have less of, what you should remove. Um, really kind of rethinking what you can be potentially adding to individual foods, to meals, to snacks to help with that blood sugar control. And then my second piece of advice is that rather than simply focusing on the carbohydrate component alone, two other things that are really, really important to focus on are meal consistency. So most of us, it's beneficial to be aiming to eat about every 3 to 4 hours. So for most people, this looks like 3 meals a day and maybe throwing in an afternoon snack or a mid-morning and afternoon snack. Um, and then also nutrient balance. So making sure that we are having these different components with our meals, rather than just that carbohydrate component. All right, so I wanted to hopefully get some participation on this slide. I think these are some of the common foods that people are like, oh, I can never eat these foods again. And I wanted to talk about how you potentially can eat these foods while keeping our blood sugar management in mind. So, does anybody have any idea if we have a diabetes diagnosis, how we could possibly eat dessert while also managing our blood sugars? You can use the chat if anyone has any idea how we can eat a cookie or a cupcake or a piece of birthday cake if we have diabetes. Does anyone have any ideas? Only 3 bites? Sorbet? Drink water and exercise afterwards? A small portion? Yeah, pair with a protein. Oh, I love this. These are all really, really great contributions. Um, you are all correct. So I'll explain a bit more. So if we are wanting to have dessert, we know that most desserts are made with refined grains. They have added sugar to them. Um, they're really sweet. They're not going to have much protein, much fiber, these other things that can help manage our blood sugars. And so, if we are just having a cookie and we haven't eaten a meal in a while, that's probably going to cause our blood sugars to increase more rapidly, right? So you can go about it's still including dessert in some different ways. So making sure that you are having dessert after you've had a meal that has, more nutritional balance. If you are really, really managing your blood sugars and wanting to stick to a certain amount of, if you do count your carbohydrates, um, you can, make sure to give yourself a smaller dessert portion, but also if you're having, a full meal beforehand, hopefully you won't be starving by the time it is you get to that cookie or that cupcake or whatever the case may be. You can also add nutrition to that dessert. I saw David, you said peanut butter. You could also try, substituting flours with half whole wheat flour. You could add nuts or seeds. And then, yeah, maybe going for a walk afterwards, and we'll get into physical activity and how that can help as well. So yep, I really, really love all of your contributions. You guys are exactly right. And I hope that this just went to drive that point home that no foods are necessarily off limits, but we can just go into eating these foods with a bit more knowledge. So I'll go through the others just for time's sake, but if we're eating pizza, making sure that that pizza does have a protein component and that it maybe has some non-starchy vegetables on top. Are you also having that pizza with maybe a side salad, so your plate, or another side that's a low carb side to help you to fill up without only having that crust that's the carbohydrate component being the main component of the meal. Pastas or white rice, I'm going to talk about these the same. Some people may just not prefer brown rice or may not prefer a whole wheat pasta, but it doesn't mean that you can't have these things. The whole wheat or the brown rice do have more of a fiber component. If you don't like them and you prefer the more refined versions, how can you add fiber in other ways to that meal? Um, how can you add protein in other ways? Yeah, eating. I will get to the stevia, Vanessa, don't worry. And using whole wheat tortilla as a pizza crust. Yep, I love to make tortilla pizzas on the grill. Sometimes it's just a heck of a lot easier than having to deal with pizza dough. And then cauliflower or whole wheat pizza crust. Yep, choosing that cauliflower because it's a lower carb option if you like it better. If you don't necessarily prefer the texture of cauliflower or you're planning on having pizza as the leftovers and it isn't that good leftover, you can always aim for that whole wheat crust option. And then, yeah, just add fiber to the top and protein to the top and fiber on the side. Um, so hopefully that was helpful as well. All right. So physical activity. I know this class was about healthy eating for diabetes, and we talked about carbs and we talked about planning and balanced meals and nutrition, but I did not want to leave out physical activity because regular physical activity can help with diabetes management. We know that moving our body regularly can be beneficial for anybody, but those specifically who are concerned about diabetes, maybe they have a risk. Um, a family history of diabetes, or they're given a prediabetes diagnosis, or you're already dealing with diabetes management. When we move our body and we incorporate some exercise, some physical activity, some joyful movement, however you want to refer to it, it actually can help our cells to become a bit more sensitive to the insulin. And so it allows our insulin to work a bit better to allow the blood sugar into our cells to be used as energy. And we talk a bit about diabetes and how blood sugar and insulin and all that works in previous presentations as well. So I'm not going to go into it today. Um, so what does this look like? The recommendation is to try to get at least 30 minutes of getting up and moving at least 5 days a week. We want to aim for this as kind of, the minimum. Anything we can add on, obviously, is great. This doesn't mean that you have to go out and get a gym membership and start doing, these really hard workouts 5 days a week. What this really means is how can we reduce our sedentary behavior? So how can we reduce standing, laying down, sitting in the car, anything that is up and moving? This can look like going out and walking your neighborhood, yoga, lifting weights, participating in group fitness classes. And what I really recommend is trying to make this activity fun. Try to incorporate some variety and invite a friend or a family member. And oftentimes, this lifestyle change to incorporate more body movement can be more sustainable. And then again, I wanted to, touch back on this point that I made at the beginning. There are other factors that do impact our blood sugar response. So we talked about food, we talked about nutrition today, but there are other things that can contribute for you specifically. These can include, but are certainly not limited to, things like stress, sleep hygiene, food access, mental health. If we're experiencing weight stigma in healthcare, our genetics that we touched on previously. Um, and that is the end of my presentation. So I'm happy that leaves us a good 15 minutes for questions. I can go back to any of these slides if anyone had wanted me to go more in depth on any of them, but I'll get to some of the questions that have already been brought up in the discussion box. And if anyone has any others, please feel free to type them in now. All right, so let me get to the stevia question first. Um, so I talked about in the Nutrition 101, I talked about the difference between sugar alcohols or sugar substitutes. And sugar substitutes, they're called non-nutritive sweeteners, things like stevia. And what that means is that they are not going to impact our blood sugars as much. Non-nutritive, they're not going to contribute to calories or carbohydrates nearly as much as sugar sweetened beverages. And so things like stevia may cause you know, sugar substitutes, things like aspartame, these are going to cause we actually don't digest them even though they taste sweet, and so they're not going to impact our blood sugars. Sugar alcohols, these things like xylitol, um, these are going to those are found in like gum and toothpaste and things like that. Those are not going to impact our blood sugars, but they taste much, much sweeter than regular sugar, or they're going to have a very, very slight impact. So stevia, you can use it as a sugar replacement. You can choose products that do contain stevia, and it's going to taste sweet, but it isn't going to elevate our blood sugars the same way that adding sugar would. Let me go up to the top and see if there are any other questions that I missed, and then I'll go and ask. How often can you drink wine and alcoholic content of the wine? That's a really, really good question. So, wine, any beer, I'm just going to talk about alcoholic beverages in general. Wine, beer, or cocktails that might be made with soda or might be made with a mixer that does contain something sweet. Those are going to increase our blood sugars. Ethanol on its own, if we're just talking about that, those can also increase our blood sugars as well. Um, if you do want to have wine, just know that it can increase your blood sugars. Maybe think of it the same way we thought about having dessert, making sure to have it with a meal rather than on its own. Um, and the recommended amount of alcoholic beverages for adults living in the United States is 1 alcoholic beverage a day for women and 2 alcoholic beverages a day for men. And those are just the standard sized. So zero soda, sugar substitutes, stevia, those all kind of fall in the same category, that they aren't going to impact our blood sugars the same as regular soda. Um, what about gluten-free flours? That's a really good question. Um, there are a ton of different gluten-free flours out there. You asked specifically about almond flour. So if we are talking about almonds in general, like a whole almond, it is going to have a fiber component because it's a nut. It is going to have some healthy fats in them, and it isn't going to have as much of a carbohydrate component as a wheat flour generally. Sometimes these different gluten-free flours can be refined a bit more. They can have additives to them, which can impact the carbohydrate number. And so, if you are looking at flours and you're wanting to, compare and contrast, you always want to again be looking at the total carbohydrate number on that food label. But then, yeah, if you want to use these other options in your baking, they can certainly help with our blood sugar management as well. They're, can potentially add more protein, can potentially add more fiber, but you'll just have to kind of look at that specific product and what it contains in it. All right. What about erythritol? I know that generally, yeah, I don't know the specifics of each type of sugar substitutes or sugar alcohols. I guess I will preface with that. I know that the non-nutritive sweeteners, the sugar substitutes, can or don't tend to increase our blood sugars at all. Sometimes those sugar alcohols can increase them in a slight amount. A rule of thumb is that we just generally don't want to be consuming too much added sweetener, whether it's a non-nutritive sweetener, whether it's a regular sweetener. Why, you ask? Because what types of foods typically are those that are sweetened? Generally, they're those types of foods that don't contain much other nutritional components, right? Like we've talked about in this presentation. Um, so, for example, if you're having lots of diet soda throughout the day, um, you know, what could you maybe be having that would increase that nutritional value because that diet soda really doesn't have much fiber, doesn't have much protein in it. Um, if you're having, like sugar-free candy throughout the day. What could you add that might be a little sweet but would also provide other nutrients in it as well? So that's kind of the mindset that I recommend going around it is, we don't want the bulk of our diet to be filled with products that are sweetened, whether it is a non-nutritive sweetener or a sweetener, because those foods are often lacking other nutrients. Are there certain foods that make you feel funny after eating them? Example, Biscoff cookies and orange juice. So we can feel funny when our blood sugars are either really, really high or really, really low. And so that is why, in this presentation, we talked about ways to keep your blood sugars more in check and a more consistent and slight rises and slight falls or moderate versus these extreme rises, extreme falls. So if we think about things like Biscoff cookies and orange juice, um, but Biscoff cookies, they aren't going to have much other nutritional components to them. Orange juice, again, it doesn't have, it's just the juice, it's just that pulp. So if you have these foods together as a snack, these might cause a really rapid increase in our blood sugars, and that might be what contributes to feeling a bit funny from them. Um, The other nutrition presentations can be seen on the YouTube channel. Oh, you answered that. And Vanessa, oh, erythritol is in stevia. Okay. Sorry, I'm a little rusty on my non-nutritive sweeteners. I am sorry about that. But I did touch on them briefly in my Nutrition 101 class and the difference between those. I give more examples that I'm blanking on off the top of my head. And if you want more information on these non-nutritive sweeteners, such as stevia, I don't know if the Diabetes Atlanta website has any information, but I know that if you go to diabetes.org, they will have some articles and some information about it. And also eatright.org, that is the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics website. And I know that they will also have resources for that as well. Anything else? All right. Well, again, hopefully the takeaways that you get from this presentation are when you're thinking of meals and snacks, now you hopefully have some more knowledge about how that carbohydrate component of the meal or snack can impact our blood sugars, but hopefully you also have information about how to eat those carbohydrate foods and be able to do so in a way that helps to keep more consistent blood sugars, help us to manage our blood sugars by, adding nutrition in other ways.
All right, everyone. This is your time to ask a couple more questions before we log off. Paige, we thank you again for an excellent presentation. One of my takeaways, and you said it, and I want to repeat it, it seems that you really want us to focus on not what we want to take away, but what can we add. And I love how you spoke on adding protein and fiber to a meal. Um, and especially when you spoke on the different food items that people enjoy. And I know people were probably speaking on some of the drinks that they enjoy. Um, you told us it's not necessarily take them away, but I think I hear you say moderation. I hear
Mhm.
you say adding something else so that you don't spend all day drinking that favorite drink, but think about, oh, could I eat an apple with some protein, as I drink this drink, Am
Mhm.
I correct in that, Paige?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Making sure we're eating consistently when we are eating meals and snacks, having a carbohydrate in them. We want to try and have more complex carbohydrates and then other components with those meals and snacks as well. So hopefully that feels less overwhelming um, than simply thinking of, well, how do I eat low carb, no carb, and
Right.
more realistic for most of us.
More realistic. And also, how can we eat it and still enjoy our meals?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I want to acknowledge that we have many of our past class participants from our diabetes self management education and support class. I see you. I thank you for being on this Wow Wednesday. I'm sure you guys can attest to how informative not only Wow Wednesday is, but our diabetes self management education classes. We just finished our second cohort of classes. For those of you who've not attended those, we are opening up two classes in the month of July. One set of classes will take place in the evening, on a Tuesday evening around 6:30, and then another set of classes will take place on Saturday mornings at 10. And you'll get to choose which group of classes you want to be a part of. Please make sure you check your emails and our website for more details. We will post those details in the next week or so. As Pamela Hurst has just said, those classes are a great resource. Everything that you heard today, we repeat in those classes. You also have access to a diabetes educator who will give even more specific examples that relate to your life. We are here to make diabetes not a death sentence, but a life sentence. You can live a productive life with diabetes. Diabetes does not have you. You have diabetes and you are overcoming. So we thank you again for joining. This video will be available in the next 48 hours on our YouTube channel. Just search Diabetes Association of Atlanta. You will also see past presentations. Also, next month, we are going to have a live cooking demonstration. Yes, we are, with the famous Chef Reggie. We love Chef Reggie. We will get the recipe out to you in advance. So be prepared to um, view a cooking demonstration live and also ask questions regarding meal planning. Okay, that's all we have for this evening. Enjoy the rest of your day. Paige, thank you again. We will see you in the future. So, you guys continue to send us topics. We have recorded all of the topic ideas that you put in the chat. I'm going to give you a couple of more minutes. Those of you who have to log off, you can. But if you have other ideas of what you want us to touch base on, please put those topic ideas in the chat and we are taking note of them. Okay, everyone, thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Paige. All right. Anybody else? Okay. All right. We will see you all next month.